All right, welcome back, gang. Chapter 5, we're going to talk about medical technology, really critical and defining part of what makes the U.S. healthcare system what it is and makes the U.S. healthcare system the envy of the rest of the world. So what is medical technology? You get from the textbook, practical application of scientific body of knowledge. So really we're talking about the practical application of science, right? We're not talking about basic science. We're talking about taking science and applying it to a problem, like how do we get a better picture of the inside of somebody's skull without cutting their head open? And so that's medical technology, right? And so ideally, medical technology is used by providers to provide higher quality, lower cost, or greater quantities of care. So ideally medical technology is going to make the quality better, the cost lower, and make or allow our providers to provide even more of it. And hopefully all three of those things, but though sometimes they work against each other. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the idea of complements and substitutes. And so I want you to kind of keep this running in your head as you think about medical technology. This is not in the textbook, by the way. So as you think about medical technology, think about, is the technology a complement? Meaning, is it being used by a provider in order to provide care in a way to enhance the provider's ability to provide care? Or is it being used as a substitute either for an older technology or to eliminate manpower from the provision of care? And remember, we've talked about this a couple of times now. Manpower is the single largest cost in the provision of care. So finding ways to substitute for manpower is an important part of medical technology. So I'm going to cover the lecture is going to break down into kind of 4 parts. I'm going to talk about medical devices, pharmaceuticals, information technology, and then we'll talk a little bit about regulation and economics of regulation. So medical devices, let's start by thinking about equipment. And so when I used to work in a hospital as a finance guy, spent a lot of time thinking about and working with my providers to figure out what is the best equipment that we should get to provide the highest quality of care that we could afford to our patients. So the best quality equipment that we could get to provide the highest quality care we can afford to provide to our patients. So broadly, what I'm thinking about here is any equipment used by providers to deliver care, and it doesn't have to be fancy, and I'll show you some examples. Specialists rely heavily on medical equipment, right, to provide care. So, and this is that complementary role. So like a radiologist, what good is a radiologist without an X-ray or an MRI or a CT, right, or a PET scan or whatever else is out there, or ultrasound, you name it. The radiologist is dead in the water without his or her technology. Surgeons can do a lot with just a scalpel and basic tools. But we're going to talk about how even surgery is adopting incredible technology today with the advances of robotic surgery. So we see, again, a complementary role. One of the interesting ways to think about a hospital or an ambulatory surgery center or other organizations is to think about, but in particular hospitals, is to think about them as doctors' workshops. A hospital is really a collection of tools and capabilities that allow a physician to provide care. And so it's kind of like if you think about it, it's like, like a community organization or a club where, like, maybe you were really into cars. And so like when I was in the military, and maybe some of our military, at least one of you is former military. So one of the things that military bases often have is a shop, an automotive shop, and you can basically pay to use the shop by the hour, and they have all these, they have a lift and they have all these tools, and you can bring your car down and you don't have to own any tools. You just go down there, use the space, and do work on your car. A hospital is, and so this is not, it's not an individual's thing. So it's this like shared facility, right? A gym is kind of like this too, right? So a gym, you don't have, you pay to use the gym, but you don't have to own all the equipment yourself. So a hospital is a lot like that for a physician, right? The physician uses the hospital, sends his patient or her patient to the hospital, where the physician then goes and provides care to the patient. And hospitals compete to attract physicians by providing the latest, coolest gee whiz technology, because physicians tend to be tech geeks. They like technology because it allows them to give better care. And so hospitals will compete with each other to try to attract physicians to direct their patients to their hospital, to the respective hospital, by having the coolest, latest equipment, the best trained nurses, the whole gamut. One of the things that I had to learn as a military guy, so having spent most of my career in, my first career in the military health system, where the physicians and the nurses and everybody was employed by the system, unlike that military system, or similar, the UK's National Health Service, where everybody is employed by the government, in the US market, physicians are mostly, well, they're all private, with the exception of those that work for like the VA. They're all private businessmen and women, and some of them, most of them are not employed by the hospital where they practice, and so they can choose. So, like for example, in Manchester, we have two hospitals. We have Catholic Medical Center and the Elliott Hospital, and physicians that practice in Manchester can choose to refer their patients to either the Elliott or Catholic Medical Center. And so if you're a surgeon, you can have privileges, meaning you have, basically you have a club membership at both facilities, and you can, say, the people at Catholic, they just got this cool new toy that I really like. I'm going to refer my patient over to Catholic, and I'm going to do my care at Catholic because I like their technology better than the Elliott. And I'm just picking arbitrarily between those two facilities. They're both great. Now, the hospital makes money by having the physician refer patients into the hospital. So if the physician chooses to send patients to Catholic rather than Elliott, or Elliott rather than Catholic, then the other hospital loses out on business. Patients don't get to choose necessarily. Patients basically go where physicians tell them to go. So that's an important function. So what I had to learn coming back around, what I had to learn coming out of the military health system was that the customer, from the hospital's perspective, the customer was not really the patient. The customer of the hospital is really the physician. The patients are kind of a secondary thing to attracting the business of the physician, because the patient is not going to self-refer to the hospital. The physician is going to refer the patient to the hospital. So the customers of hospitals are really the physicians themselves. And so that's why hospitals work so hard to attract physicians, why a lot of what they do is really around getting physicians to refer to them. And so that idea of the hospital as a doctor's workshop is a useful idea. Basically, they're trying to create this amazing gym with all this great stuff that is really more about the physician than it is about the patient. Now, hopefully there's kind of this downstream effect where the physician is choosing that hospital because the quality of the equipment, the quality of the nursing team, and they're choosing that because they know they'll have better outcomes for their patients. So it's all good, right? But it is, when it comes down to the nitty gritty of competition, hospitals are really focused on attracting physicians and physician groups to bring their business to the hospital. Okay. So thinking about it that way, nursing also uses, nursing and nursing services, both in a hospital, in a long-term care facility, in a clinic, use medical technology, both as a complement as well as a substitute. So some equipment allows for example, improved monitoring. So that would be an example of a complement, but a lot of equipment allows for substitution for using less manpower. I'm going to look at both of those. So examples of complementary technologies, right? Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, is a incredible tool that allows, it's a relatively common technology today, wasn't 20 years ago, but relatively common technology today, allows the radiologist to look at the soft tissue. So your X-rays are best for hard tissues like bone, right? But MRI allows you to basically peek inside the body without having to open it up, and gives a beautiful picture. So this is an example of complementary technology where the radiologist is using a tool to conduct his business or her business. Robotic surgery. So I mentioned, this incredible Da Vinci robot system. So this is the surgeon is sitting over here. The patient is nominally set up here. This is marketing material, so there's probably not actually a patient in there. But this is this is the cutting, and treatment part of the machine. And notice the surgeon is, 5 feet away from the patient. This is incredible, right? I actually had a chance to play on one of these things, and it's like playing in a video game. You get some control sticks with some buttons. So those of you that do a lot of video gaming, someday maybe you could be a surgeon. And this is the future. It's not every hospital doesn't have one yet, but they're getting there. And people who are going through surgical residencies now are learning how to use these tools as just, alongside learning how to do surgery with a scalpel. What I think is really cool about this, and what I could envision in the future, is the physician you see him there. The physician isn't touching the patient anymore. So we've got a nurse kind of monitoring the patient. So it's completely realistic, and I think reasonable, that 20 years from now, the surgeon who's actually doing the surgery might be sitting, say, at Mass General, and the patient might be sitting in a operating room in Berlin, New Hampshire, a 3-hour drive away. And there might be a surgical PA, for example, in the room with the OR nurses and OR techs. And, they prep the patient and get the patient lined up, and then they dial in the surgeon from Boston who does the surgery in Berlin. And then once the surgery is done, the surgeon logs off, goes on to the next case that's in, Bangor, Maine. And the surgical PA and the nursing staff close up the wound and finish off whatever's left. And what that would allow is having your surgeons kind of focused in one area, so that small hospitals like Androscoggin Valley Hospital, AVH, up in Berlin, run by a friend of mine, CEO is a friend of mine, they have a hard time recruiting high quality physicians up there. So if you can do the surgery remotely and have, a surgeon who's affiliated with a top hospital in the country, Mass Gen, for example, isn't that an amazing opportunity? So this is kind of technology going forward, but robotic surgery is becoming commonplace, used for a lot of different um, kinds of surgical procedures, and just becoming the standard of care. Now, the problem with this is, I had a chance to, the time I got to play with this was over at Exeter Hospital 3-4 years ago now. They had just gotten their first Da Vinci robot. This robot costs like over $1 million. So they spent over $1 million to get this equipment to keep their surgeons happy. The problem is you can't bill any more for a surgery because you used a robot. So now you have this $1 million overhead cost, and you've got to spread that in some way over your patients. And so that's a challenge, right? That's a financial challenge for an organization. So the only way you can really do that is by doing more surgeries. So you have to get faster, better at doing the surgeries. So talking about nursing, right, and technology and nursing technology, you think of a hospital bed as like a bed, right? Except that there are smart hospital beds now that have sensors built into the bed themselves. So the bed itself is a piece of technology. So it's not just a mattress now, right? It is a piece of technology that tracks facts about the patient and integrates into the electronic health record, and helps the nurses monitor the well-being of the patient. That allows the nurses to be more efficient. Ideally, you can actually reduce the number of nurses if you have better technology to keep track of the well-being of the patients. So we have smart hospital beds. These cute little robots. Back in the early 2000s, I was working at the military hospital in Hawaii, and we had robots that would roam the halls. And what they would do is they would come up to the wards and they would pick up lab samples, so like urine samples and other kinds of blood samples that are being gathered on the ward. The nurses would load them up in the delivery robot, and then the delivery robot would head down to the lab, deliver the samples to the lab, and the nursing staff wouldn't have to leave the ward. Well, what does that mean then? Well, that means that you don't have to have as many nurses, right? You don't have to have kind of, in this case, you wouldn't use an RN for this, but you don't have to have a human being who's carrying trays of samples down to the laboratory. These robots can do other, any sorts of delivery stuff, right? So, they could deliver meals up to the wards, you name it. They can, just move stuff around, and that eliminates the need for people. Right. And so, these are great because they're reliable. They, don't have a bad day. They don't call out sick. So these are, this is the future. Another way that technology, so you wouldn't, it's not, it's kind of high tech in the sense that, these are self-moving things, but you wouldn't immediately think about it in the same line as, say, the Da Vinci robot surgery, but this really makes the hospital system more efficient, right? And reduces cost of care potentially. Now, here's a really, kind of a lower tech, right? This isn't a robot at all. This is just some, hydraulics. This is called a patient lift. And what the patient lift allows a nurse's aide to do is move a patient or transfer a patient, say from a bed. So in the first case, from a bed to a wheelchair, then back to the bed, right? Or a bed to a commode, right? So think about if I've got a bedbound patient who's not capable of making the transfer or helping with the transfer, if I didn't have this patient lift equipment, it would take 2 or 3 people to safely move even a smallish patient from a bed into a wheelchair. But with the lift, you can do it safely and efficiently with just one employee. And so you can reduce the number of employees, and this kind of activity, picking up patients, is both dangerous for the patient because the patient can get dropped or hurt in the process, And it's dangerous for the nurses because lifting patients all day long and, this back and forth is hard on the body, and a little wrong twist. You guys are young and it probably doesn't happen to you, but you might have, thrown your back out at some point, or just gotten a kink in your back or your neck. It happens so easily. And so that's a major source of workplace injury in the healthcare field. And so these patient lifts that are, relatively speaking, low tech, right? I mean, this is not a complex piece of machinery the way a Da Vinci robot is, but it makes all the difference in the world, right? So we've been talking about kind of external equipment, but you can also think of medical devices are quite common now and are implantable. So, for example, here, Pacemaker, right, made by Medtronic, right over there in Portsmouth. And this pacemaker, so back in the day, you'd put a pacemaker in, so back in this is an older technology, and the concept is an older technology. Basically, if your heart starts to beat in a funny way, it looked like maybe you're going to have a heart attack, or stops beating, right? Or it's got an odd pattern. The pacemaker will shock the heart. And so you see these lines have been installed by the cardiologist, right? The pacemaker monitors the heart and then, provides a stimulating shock. And I'm probably totally butchering this because I'm totally, not a physician, but provides, an electroshock to the heart to get it back into normal rhythm. Now, this used to basically just be a battery, right, with a very basic mechanical system that could detect if something was going wrong, and it zapped the heart. Today's version, right, can be linked up to a smartphone, right, and provide, instant feedback back to your provider, and it can be monitored electronically. And so this is an incredible innovation that this implantable device is keeping track of and providing data about your well-being. If you're if you have one, is providing information about your well-being all day long, all night long, and your provider gets to have an incredible amount of insight into your health. One of the things that, one of the dangers with this is it turned out, because it's web enabled, right? So it's connecting to the web. You can give it commands, through the web. And Medtronic had a little bit of a stink because they were not appropriately securing access to the device, right? So conceivably, you could, if you were a bad person, they fixed it now, but these were like basically like open, open routers. Like you go into an airport and you're like, oh, let me log on here. Well, this, you could be walking down the street and you get a signal. Oh, hey, let me log on to this guy's Medtronic pacemaker. Let me just shut it off, right? Or let me send him a massive, shock to his heart. This did not happen, but there was an engineer discovered this kind of this possibility, and it took a while to get Medtronic to respond and to make appropriate software patches to protect and secure the device. So there's a lot going on here in the device world. It's much more complex than it was, but at the same time, incredible advances in technology. We also have incredible advances in prosthetics, for example. And I've got you watching a video this week that talks about prosthetics with Scott Summit. So this is one of my favorite TED Talks of all time. Totally inspiring. I hope you enjoy it. So it's a short one too. It's like 10 minutes. Also included in the FDA's definition of devices is testing, right? So diagnostic testing. So one of the things, for example, that gets regulated is 23andMe. So I don't know how many of you have done the ancestor kind of testing stuff with Ancestry.com or 23andMe, but those services are treated as diagnostic tools, right? And so 23andMe, the CEO, as this organization was coming online, has been working hard to negotiate with the FDA to determine, whether it would be regulated by the FDA as a medical device or not. And so they kind of came online under the George W. Bush administration, and that FDA said no. And then the Obama administration came in and they said, yep, we do want to regulate you. So there's sort of whipsawing around with, politics, and who's running the FDA has a lot of impact on what gets regulated and when. So that's we just went through a major transition of power from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, very different philosophies. And so you would expect to see changes resulting from that. And so that's one of the problems with regulation is it's highly dependent on the political whims of the moment. So some of you probably have Apple Watches. I do not, but I had a Fitbit for a while. Pretty limited technology, but wearables are becoming quite commonplace, and their capabilities are increasing. And so where we draw the line between a medical device and a consumer device is, getting, once upon a time, it was pretty clear. Now it's getting a little vaguer. So it's really interesting. A lot of discussion, about that going into the future. So we talked about devices. Let's talk a little bit about pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are incredible, right? We all have just lived through this pandemic, and the advances of we've had traditional vaccines for a long time. The Johnson & Johnson is kind of a standard vaccine. But then we had this new technology, the mRNA, which promises to create a whole new class of drugs, vaccines just kind of being, a convenient point to prove that they can do what they think they can do. But, there's this idea that the mRNA technology is going to be able to become kind of this dream of highly personalized medicine, right? So that we'll be able to create a vaccine. So every cancer is different, right? Every cancer is different. So, if I had lung cancer and you had lung cancer, God bless, neither one of us gets it. But if we both had, our cancers would be completely different animals. Now, they're not completely different. They have some overlaps, but every cancer is different. With mRNA technology, the idea is you could potentially develop a vaccine, essentially teach your body. Each individual could be taught, you could use this mRNA technology and teach your body to fight your personal cancer, for example. So that's again, I'm not a physician. This is way outside my area of expertise, but that's kind of the concept. And it's just mind blowing to think about. So, and the fact that it's being developed here in the United States is awesome. And is part of, we have a very expensive healthcare system, but we get the best technology in the world, right? And the rest of the world kind of drafts off of us, right? They count on us to develop everything, and then after it's been developed, they buy it. Pharmaceuticals continue to evolve and change the market. When I was your age, so when I was, I was in college in the late 80s. The AIDS epidemic was in full blast, right? People were dying by the thousands, tens of thousands, in the United States and abroad. So millions of people have died from HIV and AIDS. And much like the coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus back in, spring of 20, we really didn't know where AIDS came from. We had a really hard, so socially we were just, it wasn't really clear, and there was a lot of kind of deliberate miscommunication, in my opinion, to try to keep populations that were actually particularly victims of this from it being focused on it as, so a gay man's disease, for example. Um, uh, but if you got HIV, regardless of your sexual preference, straight people get HIV too, of course, though they tend to get it from needle sharing. So you're, the two populations that continue to get to be most vulnerable to HIV are gay men and intravenous drug users. So those are the two populations that continue to get HIV even today. The prevalence of HIV is dramatically lower. And back when I was your age, if you got HIV, it was a death sentence. You were going to die. HIV was going to kill you. And maybe sooner, maybe later, but it was going to get you. And now, in that intervening time, we've gotten much better at treating HIV. And the reality now is, so people who got HIV were convinced they were going to die of it, and many, many, many did. Not to make light of this, many did. But today, if you get diagnosed with HIV, it's basically just a really nasty chronic disease. So it's gone from a death sentence to a chronic disease. Another example, again, same kind of population. This is your Hep C, hepatitis C, was a chronic disease. Again, you have to have some sort of blood transmission. So it's gay men, intravenous drug users, and we're the most likely to get it. And Hep C will kill you if you don't treat it, and it's expensive to treat it. Well, about 8-9 years ago now, Gilead and one other pharmaceutical company developed treatments that could not only control it, but cure it. And so this was a disease that had no cure until like 2012. So no cure. You just had to live with it for the rest of your life if you got it. And it was a dangerous disease that attacks your liver. It's expensive to treat. But now they came up with a treatment that could cure you of it in a matter of a couple of months. The only problem is that they priced it at $94,000, right? That's the current price for a round of Harvoni. So we can cure you, but the cost is going to be $94,000, $95,000, right? And the downside of this is most people that have it are pretty down and out. They're Medicaid, mostly Medicaid beneficiaries. This is a very common disease to see in the prison population. And so we have this interesting conundrum where, we're very generous with Medicare, right? Medicare is a fabulous benefit, very generous benefit. Medicaid, the insurance for our poor people, much, much less generous. And so the question is, do we pay for, what are the ethics to pay for $100,000 treatment, let's call it, for someone who is in prison for murder, right? I'm a softie. I want to treat everybody, but there's but that's a real cost. $100,000 in medical care is a real cost. And so we'll talk about cost benefit analysis here in a minute, but if you treat somebody and you cure them of Hep C, you don't have all the chronic care treatments. So you can look at the cost up front, $94,000, versus the ongoing care and comorbidities that are going to come about as a result of having Hep C for decades, right? And the cost of all the treatment that comes from that. And you can compare the two. And that's where we get into cost benefits. We'll talk about that in a minute. But, advances in pharmaceuticals are amazing. And I interviewed some of you. Some of you might be interested in listening to my interview with the chief medical officer for Harvard Pilgrim. And one of his arguments was, look, pharmaceuticals are super expensive, but they can have incredible benefits that might eliminate the need for surgery, for example. And so, particularly say oncology drugs, right? So drugs that treat cancers. That's a huge opportunity that needs to be considered. So drugs are incredible, and they're becoming more, not less important in our treatment system. So why are pharmaceuticals so expensive? Well, we have enormous development costs. The Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, published just recently an article saying that the cost to bring a new drug to market is $985 million, right? So that's almost $1 billion to bring a new drug to market. So, and that includes a lot of failures, right? So along the way, so that includes those costs. And so it's very expensive to bring a drug to market. So once it gets to market, the pharmaceutical company has to charge a price high enough to make up that $985 million in costs, right? And so how do they do that? Well, you get a patent, right, on an invention, and it gives you basically a 20-year monopoly. Nobody can copy it for 20 years. Now, the problem is they usually get the patent as soon as they come up with the idea. And so while they're getting the drug approved, and that might take 5 or 7 years, the patent clock is ticking. And so by the time, let's say, they get the drug approved, they might only have 12 years left on the patent. And that means they have to charge an even higher price to try to earn back that $1 billion investment. And that's an average, right? To bring back that $1 billion investment, because after the patent after the patent ends, generic drug makers can start copying that drug. So let's talk about generics. So generic is an amazing, this is what's helps control our costs. Most of the medications I take are generic knockoffs. So, Motrin is, something basic, like you take it after a good night out at Scorps, drinking downtown. You wake up with a headache, you take some Motrin, right? Well, you could take Motrin, brand name Motrin, or which costs you, say, $10 for a bottle, or you could take the generic Rite Aid version of Motrin, which would be called ibuprofen. That's the chemical component. So it'd just be Rite Aid ibuprofen as opposed to Motrin. And Rite Aid ibuprofen is probably $2 a bottle, whereas the branded version is $10 a bottle. That's, over-the-counter drugs. That same pricing gap applies to prescription drugs, including complicated stuff like HIV medication, right? And Harvoni, the Hep C drug that we talked about, will go off patent probably sometime pretty soon. And there'll be a generic version of Harvoni, and it won't be $94,000 anymore. It might be a bargain $25,000, right? So the FDA classifies a generic, and this is straight off their website, if it contains the same active ingredients. So Motrin and ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is the active ingredient, right? It has the same strength, same dosage, and then same administration. So do you take it, do you take it as a pill? Is it a cream that you rub on your skin, or is it something that you inject? So it's got to essentially be the same drug, right, for the FDA to approve it. And if you can prove similarity, it's relatively easy to get through the FDA. So you're not having to do that $985 million investment if you're a generic drug manufacturer. You can get through a lot cheaper. So generics bring down drug costs, and it's a critical thing. The largest generic manufacturers are overseas in China and India. India, in particular, has a huge pharmaceutical industry. And the FDA is really great at regulating in the United States, right? Because it's a U.S. Agency, and it's, you got the FDA has guys and gals with guns and badges, and they can come knocking on your facility if you are a drug manufacturer operating in the United States. But the Chinese government and the Indian government don't feel so great about U.S. Law enforcement people showing up in their country with their guns and badges. So it's a very different animal. I've assigned you this video, A Dose of Reality, with what's her name? Blanking on her name. Anyway, really interesting video talk. She's an investigative reporter, looked into the issue of generics, and the real challenges of regulating a global supply chain of generic drugs. She wrote a very good book called Bottle of Lies, which I've read and would recommend to you if you're interested in healthcare, especially those of you in that biology. A bunch of you are in the biological sciences. Great book. You'd probably get a big kick out of it. She writes very, very well. And she writes and talks in the talk about the challenges of managing a global supply chain, where it's really hard to see the quality of the inputs that are going into the little pills that we're taking, and then even knowing where they came from. When you go into Rite Aid and you buy your generic bottle of whatever, how do you know that it didn't come from a bad batch in, India, for example? Okay, so switching gears a little bit to talk about information technology in healthcare. So there's a whole field called informatics, health informatics, and health IT, HIT, HIS, health information systems. Fabulous area if you're interested in getting into healthcare management. Really good money to be made in that field, and really rewarding and interesting work. But basically, informatics is how do we use data and information to improve the delivery of healthcare? And so, some examples. I'm going to talk about each of these here in a second. So let me run through these. So, electronic health records. This is an incredible piece of technology that makes physicians absolutely crazy, particularly primary care physicians. But it's an incredible piece of technology, right? When I was first in healthcare in the early 90s, physicians kept all of their records on paper, and so I would, whenever I moved from post to post, when the Army shifted me, I went and I picked up my paper records in a big fat green jacket, and I carried it to my next clinic, and I dropped it off. When I got to my new post, I brought it into the clinic and dropped it off. The problem with that is, what if I got, so that's sitting in the clinic, what if I got in a car accident, right? And I had to go to the emergency department. Well, the clinic's closed, right? And it's locked up for the night. And there I am in the emergency department. Even if it's in the same organization, the same facility, right? They couldn't just get the medical record. And so the ED physician wouldn't have any information about me. So imagine if I was unconscious and say my wife wasn't along with me, right? Even if they knew who I was, they wouldn't be able to find anything out. Now with the electronic health record, right, they just pull up the health record and they have access to my entire medical history. And they can see, oh, Bonica's got this or that wrong with him, right? He's got a chronic condition. Maybe he's got HIV, right? Which they might like to know especially if I'm bleeding all over the place. So it's a really amazing technology. It allows the providers all to kind of see the same. If the providers are in the same system, it allows them all to see the same system. And the EHR can be programmed to do a lot of cool stuff. Like it can kind of prompt the provider, be like, you're saying that, Bonica has X. Well, based on, protocols, you should, have you considered A, B, and C. So the EHR provides this longitudinal record of all my care that's accessible to other physicians, and that's a really huge value. With all that data, as we start to accumulate all that data at the system level, we can start working on what's called population health. And this is kind of the holy grail of healthcare going forward, is what we want to do, what we care about. We talked about what is the definition of health? Well, it's not the absence of disease, it's an overall state of well-being. Well, what we want to do is prevent disease, right? Primary prevention. We want to prevent disease from happening. And so as we accumulate all this data in these electronic health records, we can start to use computers to screen through it, use tools to screen through this material, right, and start to make predictions about who's going to get sick. Providers can start, a good predictive analytics program can go in and pull out, hey, these 10 people have been seen, repeatedly for a particular condition. We need to bring them in for some sort of preventive work, maybe get some additional tests done on them to see, because, what we've seen in the past is people with these kinds of markers in their health record maybe develop cancer. Maybe they develop heart disease. Maybe they develop something else, right? And so predictive analytics gets to look at all this data and start to pull together a sneak peek of what's happening. And so this is kind of, like I said, the holy grail of the future is population health and keeping people from getting sick to begin with, like this primary prevention that we talked about in previous chapters. There, along that same line, is the integration of machine learning and artificial intelligence, so ML and AI. Basically what ML is, and they're kind of, again, this is where the technology is beyond me. We actually have an analytics program where, in my department, and there are people in that program that could talk all day long about the differences between machine learning and AI. It's all kind of mushy to me, kind of the same. But the idea is that you can train a computer to use algorithms and to recognize patterns. And frankly, that's a lot of what medicine is a physician is taught to recognize, to run through an algorithm, to run through these steps of diagnostics and follow a little, workflow to identify what might be wrong with you. Well, they're basically, physicians are kind of human computers, right? And so a computer can also be taught to follow an algorithm. In fact, they're really, really good at it. And like I said before, they never have a bad day, right? They don't break up with their boyfriend or girlfriend and come to work pissed off. And so while they're pissed off because they just got dumped, and your brain scan comes in front of them and they're all weepy about the fact that, their special person isn't their special person anymore, and they miss some critical thing, like you've got an aneurysm in your brain, right? A blood vessel that's going to explode and kill you, right? Because they're distracted. Computers never have that. So if they're trained properly, they can actually be more effective. So radiology is one of the areas where we're seeing the application of AI and machine learning early on. So the concept is an AI or a machine, a computer, is really, really good. But what's even better is if you couple a machine with a human being who has the intuition and the ability to kind of see errors. And so a computer could go flying through 1,000 scans, right? And it might pop out 3 and say, hey, doc, I need you to look at these 3 because they're weird and they don't follow, they don't make sense with the algorithms that I've been programmed with. And the doc would look at them and say, okay, these 3, this is this, this is this. And then the machine would integrate that new learning. And so the next time that those 3 things showed up, they'd already know it. And so that's an example of machine learning, is the machine can be trained, right, with additional information. But there's always kind of a component of human intuition that, it's a machine. And so coupling a machine and a human is a really powerful way to work. And so this, again, is a complementary technology. Okay, so shifting to thinking about communications, and technology as communications, telehealth and telemedicine. Actually meant to do this next slide first. Let me do this one and then I'll come back. So I'm sure you've heard about doc in a box kind of applications where you can, and maybe you've even used them. I don't know, where you can get, a telemedicine visit. I think actually the health services might be offering some of these things, but you can do telemedicine, right? You can dial up a doc, and a lot of times they can diagnose minor illnesses just by having a conversation with you, right? They're running through that algorithm, and they're, as you talk to them and tell them what, I had a cough for the last 3 days. Okay. Do you have a fever? No. All right. It sounds like maybe you've got a, some sort of infection. I'm going to write you a prescription, and I'm going to electronically send it to Rite Aid down in Durham, and you go pick it up, right? So that's provider to patient, or in the kind of in marketing speak, that's business to consumer, or B2C, B2C, B2C. I mean, my New Hampshire accent's coming out there. Incredibly cost effective, right? You don't have to, first of all, you don't have to drive to see the doctor. All you do is dial them up on your cell phone or dial them up on your computer. The doctor could be almost anywhere. There are challenges with licensing, but, the doctor could be sitting in Lebanon, up at Dartmouth Hitchcock, and you could be down here in Durham, or they could be sitting, at Wentworth Douglas in Dover, 5 miles away. It doesn't matter, because you're on this telehealth system. Or they could be sitting in California or Mumbai, as long as they have a New Hampshire medical license, they would be authorized to do this kind of care. So it eliminates, geographic barriers, right? And it's great for a lot of primary care. Telepsychiatry is really incredible. It's great for that. Telepsychology, so teletherapy, really good for that. Tele Dermatology. So these are, and a lot of other consults. I recently had in the last couple of months, I've been seeing a GI doc. And so I had my first experience, during COVID, was to have a telemedicine visit with her. And so we had a conversation. She didn't feel she needed to physically examine me based on the conversation. So that was a huge time saver for me. And given that we were in the middle of COVID, it was nice not to have to actually physically go and be in a space that wasn't, my own. Back up. So we talked about business to consumer telehealth, but we also have business to business, or B2B, B2B. So Dartmouth Hitchcock, for example, has a significant telehealth program, and telemedicine is kind of a subset of telehealth. So they have a significant telehealth program where they're offering primary care. I believe they're offering teleradiology, so they provide radiology support. But one of the exciting programs, business to business or provider to provider programs that kind of came on, not just at Dartmouth Hitchcock, but kind of all around the health system, was this Telestroke Concept. And so this little image here is meant to show, imagine you're, again, like let's say Androscoggin Valley up in Berlin, tiny little hospital. It's a 26-bed hospital. It's called a critical access hospital, tiny little hospital. They don't have a neurologist on staff. So if you are brought into the emergency department and they think you might be having a stroke, so you've got this incredible headache, you can't move your right side, they're trying to rule out, is this a stroke or is it something else? Well, they don't have a neurologist, right? Which is a doctor that specializes in this kind of brain disease, right, on staff. And so what they would have to do is, if they suspected you were having a stroke, they would have to put you on a medevac flight, right? So they'd put you on a medical helicopter and fly you to Dartmouth Hitchcock, where there was, which would be the closest neurologist, and they'd have to rule it out. Sometimes that's totally warranted. If you're actually having a stroke, you want to be brought to Dartmouth Hitchcock. But there are things that even before they take you to Dartmouth Hitchcock that they could do at Androscoggin to improve the likelihood or your likely outcomes. So being able to know, yes, this person is in fact having a stroke, is really useful. So what they have is Telestroke, right? So they have at Dartmouth Hitchcock, they have a team of neurologists on call, and then they have basically a dock on a stick, right? An iPad on a stick. I mean, it's a little more sophisticated. And what they do is they ring up the neurologist at Dartmouth Hitchcock. That person gets on the line, and the ED doc helps the neurologist run through a series of tests to see whether you're having a stroke or not. And based on that diagnosis, the neurologist can give a diagnosis at that point saying, yeah, the person's probably not having a stroke. You should just keep them there. Or that person's having a stroke. I need you to do A, B, and C, and then get him on, and then we're sending the helicopter, right? So it's really important to be able to identify that for the well-being of the patient. Now, most of the time, this is the thing, most of the time, people coming in might be showing some sign of potential stroke, but aren't having a stroke. And the ED doc is pretty sure they're not having a stroke, but because they're not a neurologist, they can't make that final diagnosis without getting a neurologist. And so if they have even the slightest thought that maybe you're having a stroke, if there's no way to contact a neurologist, they'll be calling in the life flight, and a helicopter will be coming to pick you up, and you'll be flown to Dartmouth Hitchcock at great expense to you, your insurance company, and inconvenience, right? And not a little bit of terror in the whole process. And so what this program allows is the elimination of a lot of medical waste, right? Overtreatment. And it allows a small hospital like an Androscoggin to hang on to more of its patients. And so there are other programs like that. Telestroke is probably the most common one. But Dartmouth Hitchcock also has, for example, a Tele-ED program where they have board certified emergency department physicians standing by in a communications center. And small hospitals like Androscoggin, I'm just picking on them because a friend of mine runs it. But you could think of Memorial or some of the other small hospitals that are up in the North Country. They very often don't have ED, emergency physicians, emergency medicine physicians, board certified emergency medicine physicians running their EDs. You might have a family practice doc working in your ED, or you might have even maybe a PA running your ED, depending on where you are. And so programs like Tele-ED provide that PA, for example, or that family medicine doc instant access to a board certified emergency medicine doctor when something really challenging comes in. So those are examples. Talked about that one. Also important is kind of from a technology perspective is the integration of clinical and business systems, right? So one of the complaints your book has is, and it's true, the US is really inefficient in terms of administrative costs. So the advances in IT that bring together the business systems and the clinical systems allows for an improvement in the efficiency of the organization, the running of the organization. So for example, if your clinical system is well integrated with your scheduling system, you can get a better count of the number of nurses that you might need. And that's, again, manpower is one of the biggest, it's the most expensive thing in a hospital, and it's the most expensive thing in most healthcare delivery. You can integrate your ordering of supplies, so you don't have to pay for large stocks of supply. You can be more efficient at running and scheduling your operating room. These are all areas where we can eliminate a lot of waste. On top of that, the electronic health record drives the revenue cycle. So we get a patient comes in, gets seen, that information has to flow from the doctor's record, the doctor typing in the record, right? That has to flow to a coder who then puts on the appropriate code that then generates a bill. Then that has to be transmitted to the insurer. Then the insurer has to make a payment to the bill, right, for the bill, and so on. It's like there's this whole process, and this is called the revenue cycle. And we need that to work well, and we need it to work efficiently because, we have a private system, mostly private system. But we need that to work well. We need this integration, not necessarily the revenue cycle piece, but this integration to work well, even when we have all government-run systems like the U.S. military health system, the MHS that I kind of grew up in, or, for example, the British National Health Service. So it's critical to have this integration of clinical and business systems because it removes waste out of the system. So let's talk about, a few more minutes, I'm going to talk about a few more topics around regulation and economics. So I wanted to run through some important milestones. There's a lot in your book. I'm not going to hit all of them, but basically the first point at which the FDA or its predecessor, the Division of Chemistry, the Department of Agriculture's Division of Chemistry, was tasked with basically reviewing safety, the safety of drugs, and this is kind of particularly interstate commerce. So 1906, kind of the precursor for the FDA. In 1930, the FDA name was implemented. In 1938, we had a kind of a disaster. So the 1906 was mostly post. So something was introduced, and then the FDA would follow up on it. In 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act authorized and required the FDA to regulate pre-marketing. So we had to, at that point, manufacturers had to show the FDA, prove to the FDA, at the level of dosage that we are planning to use, this drug is safe for administration, right? So most drugs are dangerous if they are misused, right? So if you were to go down to your medicine cabinet and grab a bottle of Tylenol and just kind of start chugging them all down, you'd die. You would poison your liver and you'd die. But Tylenol is totally safe if you take it, 3 200 milligram pills per day, not more than that. That's totally safe, or whatever it is. I usually take Motrin myself. So, 3 200 milligram Motrins a day is like nothing. It'll make you feel a little bit, if you've got sore muscles, it'll make you feel a little bit better, but it certainly won't hurt you. But if you swallow the whole bottle, that will probably poison you. So the point here is that manufacturers come in and say, hey, our recommended dose is 100 milligrams 3 times a day, and the FDA be like, all right, that's safe. This elixir of sulfanyl, I can't say it, whatever. The problem there was they had the thing that was making the sulfa drug dissolve turned out to be poisonous, and so when people started taking it, they started dying. So 38, we have the requirement for safety, right? And then in 1962, we had the thalidomide disaster. You may have, this was the flipper babies. So what this was, thalidomide was a sleeping drug that was being given in particular to pregnant women. It turned out that if you took thalidomide while you were pregnant, it caused birth defects, in particular the malformation of the hands and feet to make them look like flippers. And so it was this awful flipper baby thing. And so that triggered another round of increased regulation. And so the FDA was now required not only to conduct pre-market reviews of safety, but also of efficacy. So not only is it safe, which really, so I'm not sure how we got from thalidomide to efficacy, but but not only are they required to look at safety, but they're supposed to now, and since 1962, the FDA has to verify your claims. So it used to be, all right, if I take 200 milligrams of Motrin 3 times a day, it's going to make me feel less sore. The FDA from 1906 to 1962 would have just said, okay, does it poison the guy when he takes 3 a day? No. Okay, fine. After 1962, not only did they have to say, yep, it's not going to poison you if you take 3 a day, but also it really does, in fact, make your muscles feel less sore, right? So it moved from just a pure safety check to efficacy as well. Some other important dates in regulation, not just of the FDA, but in other regulations. 1976 Medical Device Amendment. So the FDA picks up the requirement to ensure safety and effectiveness of medical devices, including diagnostic products. So this is the amendments that the FDA now had to review things like 23andMe comes out of this, right? But not only that, like X-ray machines, right? So the FDA has to review that they're safe to use and they actually do what they say they're going to do. So medical devices are also reviewed by the FDA. So like not only the 23andMe, but more importantly, things like pacemakers, like we talked about. 1983 with the Orphan Drug Act. This doesn't really have anything to do with the FDA, except that it gives the FDA the ability to help companies. Basically, it encourages the FDA to assist companies in getting drugs through the system that are for smaller populations. So if you have a rare disease, there isn't if there's a small population of people who are likely to buy the disease. Remember, it's expensive to get the drug done, right? The drug approved, right? That $983 million price tag, right? And so if you've got a small population that's likely to wind up buying that drug, it takes, you might not be able to pay it back. So the FDA is supposed to make it a little easier for companies that are working on drugs for people for rare diseases. And then finally, in 1992, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act requires manufacturers to pay fees to the FDA as part of their application to get a drug authorized. And the FDA is supposed to use these fees to increase the speed at which they do their reviews. Now, one of the things to think about with this, in particular, this last piece, is remember the Kefauver, whatever it is, Harris drug amendments came about as a result of the thalidomide disaster, right? So this is a drug that had been, had passed through the safety checks that were in place prior to 1962, went out and turned out wasn't safe after all. Blows back up in the FDA's face, right? Because, if you're a regulator and your job is to prove that a drug is safe, and you let a drug go through and it turns out it's not safe, you really have all downside. The flip side of this is if you're a regulator and you're reviewing drugs, you have no incentive to move them along quickly, right? Because you want to be super sure that the drug is safe, because if the drug isn't safe and you approve it, you might lose your job. But if you just drag your feet and take a long time to get a drug approved, nothing's going to happen to you. So there's an incentive for the FDA to be hyper conservative, right? And so after 1962, the FDA becomes even more conservative, right? And it has the effect of slowing down approval of drugs. So the 1992 Prescription Drug User Fee Act was meant to kind of help offset some of that. What we saw during COVID was it didn't fix a whole lot. The FDA was very, very slow to approve COVID testing kits, and then it was very slow to approve the immunizations. And the immunization was developed by Moderna and Pfizer, over like a weekend in January of 20, right? And it took a year for the FDA for Moderna and Pfizer to prove the efficacy, the safety and efficacy of the drugs before the FDA would release, allow them to be used. So the question is, could we have gotten those immunizations out sooner? Maybe at the rate people were dying, a month would have been tens of thousands of lives. So something to think about when you build a system where the incentive of the regulator is to be hyper conservative. You get what you pay for. That's one of the lessons from economics. Okay, let's talk a little bit about cost benefit analysis, and we're almost done. One more slide after this. So cost benefit analysis. This is kind of pretty intuitive, right? If you're gonna invest in something, you want the benefits to be greater than the costs. Well, we apply this same logic to new technology. If we're going to pay for new medical technology, we want the benefits to outweigh the costs, and so we have this concept called cost benefit analysis, and the basic idea is that you can put a dollar value on both the cost, right? So, for example, the cost of a new treatment, if it costs $200,000, or let's say $100,000 for, I should have used the example I used from Harvoni, right? $94,000. What's the benefit? Well, the benefit of Harvoni at $94,000 would be, let's say you're giving it to a 25-year-old intravenous drug user. You cure him of Hep C, his life expectancy is another 50 years. He won't have to take drugs for the next 50 years to treat his Hep C. You could add up the cost of those drugs for 50 years and compare them to the cost of the Harvoni treatment, and you'd get a benefit cost ratio. So typically even though it's called a cost benefit analysis, we wind up with a benefit cost ratio where we put the benefit in the numerator and the cost in the denominator. And we say, if it's greater than 1, right? So in this case, if we have a $300,000 benefit, right? If we extend life for 3 years, assuming a life is $100,000 a year, and that's kind of the standard economic assumption. So if we can extend life by 3 years, that's worth $300,000. If the cost is $200,000, we have a cost benefit of 1.5. A more sophisticated approach is to say, well, it might extend life a year or 3 years, but those 3 years life is going to be kind of crappy. So for example, maybe you're on a ventilator for 3 years. Well, yay, what a great quality of life that is. And so maybe 1 year, yes, you have a year of life, but it's really 1 year of life on a ventilator is only 20% of what 1 year of normal health would be. And so a quality adjusted life year is adjusted for the quality of the life. So if you have a 0.2 quality, you might have a year of life, but your quality of life, because your quality of life is low, you really only have the equivalent of 0.2 years. And so we can adjust. You could then say, all right, well, the benefit isn't really $300,000. It's really, say 0.2 times 3. So 0.6, right, would be the 0.6 years because it's 0.2 per year. We have 3-year extension. So if we have 3 years at a 0.2 quality, that's 3 times 0.2 is 0.6 times $100,000 value. So 0.6 times 100,000 is 600,000 divided by the $200,000 cost. And now you have something less than 1. So these are the kinds of tools that you have to use, especially when patients aren't paying for their own care. So for example, in the UK, the National Health Service uses these kinds of cost benefit analysis type analysis to decide whether they're going to adopt new technology or not. The basic idea here is if the treatment is going to cost you nothing as a patient, then you're going to say, yeah, give it to me, right? I'll take that. Even if it's the cost benefit ratio is out of whack. Well, to me, its cost is 0. So it doesn't matter. It's all benefit to me, but somebody's got to pay for it. And if this health system has to pay for it, then you have to come up with a system, an approach for controlling utilization. And so supply side controls supply side controls are an approach. Sorry, I lied. I've got one more slide after this. Supply side controls are an approach for controlling when the market, right, isn't going to do the controlling for you. So when the patient faces a 0 cost, they're going to behave like it's free, even though it might be $200,000. So examples of supply side controls include, using cost benefit analysis to just say, we're not going to offer that technology, or we're going to offer it, but we're only going to offer a little bit of it. So if you want it, you're going to have to wait a long time. I'll put you in a queue and make you wait. And a lot of people just say, forget it. I'm not going to get it after all. These cost benefit analyses result in very stringent approvals of technologies and treatments. And the result is, for example, a limited formulary. So a formulary is the list of drugs that a pharmacy might carry. So the National Health Service pharmacy will have a formulary that includes some things, probably mostly generics, and excludes a lot of brand name drugs. Same with the military health system. You can't get brand name drugs in the military health system if there's a generic that's approved and available. All right, last slide, I promise, Scout's honor. Certificate of need laws are an example of a supply side control. So these came about nationally as a result of the National Health Planning and Resources Development Act of 1974. So back in the 70s, government, the 60s and 70s, government was very confident that they could, get a bunch of smart guys in a room and they could come up with really clever ways to fix healthcare, amongst other things, everything else too, but healthcare. And so what they said was, what we need is this at the local level. We need to have boards that look to determine whether new services should be created and allowed or not. So these things are called certificate of need or CON boards. So New Hampshire had a certificate of need board that would meet and discuss whether a new service should be brought in into a particular geographic area. So, for example, if you wanted to build a hospital in Durham, back when we had a certificate of need board, you would have to drop your plans, drop your analysis, and go to the certificate of need board and make an argument. Hey, I should be able. You should give me permission to build a hospital in Durham. Now, what the certificate of need board then did was it heard from all the people in the community who had an opinion about that. So who might have an opinion about whether there's a need for a hospital in Durham? Well, there's a hospital in Rochester called Frisbee. There's a hospital in Portsmouth Regional. There's a hospital in Dover called Wentworth Douglas. And there's a hospital in Exeter called Exeter Hospital. And all of them would be impacted if you built a new hospital in Durham. And so all their CEOs would truck down to the certificate of need board and say, hey, there's no need for a hospital in Durham. Look, we're already out here. We're taking care of patients. We've got plenty of room. No reason to build a hospital. And so the certificate of need board would say, no, you can't build your hospital in Durham. Sorry. So what that did was it politicized a lot of processes, and it reduced competition. So in 1987, that very bad idea was repealed. But once these sorts of things get put into place, they kind of metastasize like cancer. And it gets very hard to get rid of them because there's a lot of people that have a lot of money at stake and want them to stay in place. New Hampshire, because it's the live free or die state, got rid of theirs back in 2015. Maine has some sort of certificate of need program. I don't know it. Vermont has some of the most pervasive and restrictive certificate of need laws in the country. I get a chance to listen to the president of the Vermont Hospital Association talk about this organization called the Green Mountain Care Board every year, and then just how they make the hospitals jump through hoops to do pretty much anything. So I personally think certificate of need is a big con, as in like convict con. And I'm glad that New Hampshire got rid of it, and I'd like to see it gone from the rest of the country. So, all right. So I hope this is interesting to you. I realize it's a bit longer of a lecture, but there's a lot of great stuff here. The chapter is quite good, very detailed. All right. So that's good for this one.